I prepared a few words just to start off myself. I'm Horst Zank, I'm from Manchester. I had the pleasure to organize this session, and I'm glad that many of you came. It's quite a while ago since Sarah Lichtenstein and Paul Slovic prepared a nice paper in which they challenge one of the fundamental principles that we use for rationality called transitivity. We use it as if, you know, it belongs to every theory nearly, except for some theories, and one of these theories is the one that we talk about today. That is regret theory. So several alternative decision theories were proposed, say, quite early after expected utility, but those that matured and have remained among us are just a few, among which is also the regret theory model of Loomes and Sugden. There were actually 3 papers that came, I think even in the same years they were published, so 3 different papers from different authors came together. The one that gave us the opportunity to organize this session is the one that appeared in the Economic Journal. I have also the pleasure to have the authors of the original papers here, one of which is Bob. He will start the session soon. I have Graham there. And I have a team of Dutch players also in this game. Peter Wakker, Marcel Zeelenberg, and Han Bleichrodt. We will have short presentations of 10 to 12 minutes of each presenters. So that's very short. I hope if there are no urgent questions, you can keep them towards the end, where we have some 30 minutes for discussions and questions as you wish. So we will start off with Bob. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Yes, I mean, Graham's and my paper, Regret Theory, has been included in this collection of classic papers from the history of the EJ, and we're obviously very, very honoured and pleased to find our names alongside Hugh Dalton, Ramsey, Keynes, Harrod, Becker, Stiglitz, Atkinson, so here we are. Probably, maybe the EJ's, perhaps the EJ's has gone down since the days of Keynes, I don't know, but anyway, it's very nice. So, and I put quote marks in because actually what I wanted to talk about here was not actually the history of regret theory, the theory or the idea, but just the paper, since in a sense it's the paper that's being celebrated, I hope celebrated. As Horst already said, just one quick aside on history, that as well as our paper in 1982, there were 2 other papers, David Bell in Operations Research and Peter Fishburne in Journal of Mathematical Psychology, and all 3 of these papers are presenting very similar theories, as it turns out. They were worked out entirely independently, and it was only at a sort of late stage when we were writing the paper that we discovered these parallels. But so they're independent papers, but they're very similar ideas. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the paper itself. Well, to do this, I've been scanning through Graham's been scanning through his filing cabinets, finding old documents. I've been going through my diary and retrieving bits about regret theory. And it seems that we started thinking about regret theory in 1981. In 1981, Graham and I were both working at the University of Newcastle. We were both, at the time, quite young and new appointments there. Graham was what was called research officer, which was a rather low-grade post name, we say, Graham. It was sort of just at the hanging on by his fingernails under sort of academia, having previously been a school teacher, and his interest was mainly Marxian economics. He was, I think, running on the transformation problem, is that right? Transformation problem. But he was also interested in biology of statistical life. I was the new reader. I'd been appointed, I think, on promise at the time rather than achievement. I was seen as this sort of great hope. And I was working on social choice theory, which was the topic of the time. And one day, when we were at the tea break at Newcastle, Graham asked me, being a social choice theorist, ought to know about axioms, he said, why is transitivity treated as an axiom of rationality? With the obvious implication, well, he thought it shouldn't be, but I, as a social choice theorist, ought to tell him why social choice theory thought it should be. And I said, well, actually, I don't think it should be, because I said there's no justification for this because Savage, way back in 1951, had produced a model of minimax regret. And okay, it was a well-known piece of theory, although not standardly used, and it was internally consistent. It was a model of reasoning, but it could produce cycles of choice. So I said, well, actually, since you can't see anything obviously irrational with this theory, I can't see how anybody could put their hands on the heart and say that transitivity was an axiom of rationality. Well, it was just a tea break conversation. I didn't really think anything more about this, but it just showed the lines on which we were thinking, in particular the lines I was thinking on, but obviously at this time Graham too. This was a time when the axiomatic analysis of rational choice was one of the hottest topics for theorists, and Graham and I were obviously both sceptics. Sceptics at this point, or at least in this conversation, about whether the conventional model of rationality was defensible in its own terms. Was it defensible as a theory of rationality? The answer is, my answer is no, it's not. It's not. If you say these are axioms of requirements of rationality, I can't really see how you can justify it. Anyway. Sometime later, this is in Graham, a colleague, apparently she was ironing at the time, he listened to Radio 4, and heard this programme where these two unknown psychologists, or unknown to us, Cardiff University, talking about framing. And they were talking about this paper that they published in Science that year. And our colleague thought, oh, Graham's interested in statistical life, framing problems, perhaps will be interested in this. Graham followed this up and found the prospect theory paper and started thinking about their experimental results. Well, the first I knew about this was, he came to me and said, well, I've been thinking about this, I've got a sketch of a theory. This theory explains many of Kahneman-Tversky's results. And basically this was regret. Obviously in a fairly sort of rudimentary form, but it was, basically this was regret theory it produced. And as soon as I understood how this theory worked, I could see it was a great idea. I thought it was a great idea. And as I'd had more experience, well, not a lot, of writing theoretical papers, we decided on a mutually beneficial collaboration, so we developed the theory together. And as far as I can see from my diary, it didn't take very long, because we started writing the paper. And obviously the January 81 was when Kahneman-Tversky's paper came out. So since then, Graham's been thinking about it a bit. April 81, we started writing the paper, so I just talked about it a bit before then. By June, we'd finished the paper, sent it off to Econometric. They rejected it, although I must say quite politely. I mean, and we did really think about it seriously and say it's worth reading, like what with the modern way of dealing with interesting and novel papers. We sent it to EJ and came out in December 1982. We also sent a paper to AER, which they accepted, which showed how regret theory could explain preference reversal in instance of non-transitive preference. And, well, that's the brief history, you might say, of the paper. So I want to say, first of all, why did regret theory start? I said that as soon as Graham showed me this theory, I thought it seemed like a really good idea. Why did it seem a good idea to me then, 1981? What appealed to me about it then? Well, the first thing that appealed to me, I mean, this is not the first, this is a list of things. One of the things that appealed to me was that, well, it represents decision-making in a way that any decision theorist ought to recognise as rational. It's a maximising model. Decision-making maximise the expected value of what we now call experience utility. And the only difference between that and standard EU is that experience utility can include positive and negative feelings from comparisons between what is and might be. So it's a fairly standard maximising structure. Not hasten to add that I thought that maximising structure was essential to rationality. I didn't think either. To be quite frank, I never really believed in rationality as a concept, let alone axiomatizing it. So, but it was something you could write down and say, look, you know, even if you take this theory seriously and you think your job is to use a theory of rational choice, this is a theory of rational choice because it obeys all the standard rules of what you think is a theory of rational choice. Also, how it differs from standard theories by introducing an extra feeling into the experience utility, feeling of regret when what you've got is less good than you might have had chosen differently. Most people can recognise this by introspection. So if you say, well, actually this looks like a rational theory, that's another reason to think it looks like a rational theory, because it's not only got a maximising structure, the feelings that have been put into the theory are feelings that everyone can recognise they feel themselves, most people recognise they feel themselves. So it seems like a reasonable thing. So also another thing about it is it's a very simple, elegant mathematical structure. So it's a counterexample to what at the time was quite a common line of thought, think, well, it's all right to be psychological. It would be nice in a way if theories could be psychologically realistic, but of course economics, we need simple, elegant theories, so we can safely ignore psychological detail because we need to keep to simplicity. So actually regret theory is pretty simple and straightforward. So it's no real reason to ignore it for that reason. Yet, and of course this is in a certain sense what appealed to me, it's actually radically non-standard if you think about it axiomatic, because it allows preferences which violate transitivity and also stochastic dominance, at least stochastic dominance with respect to independent lotteries. And most theorists at the time, I think probably Peter probably still does, but most theorists at the time treated these axioms as fundamental principles of rationality, although they might just be willing, and some of them, the more avant-garde, the more daring, were willing to consider giving up the independence axiom. So we thought, well, yes, actually, so what's nice about this is that it's, and of course also, we're now finding that the patterns of behaviour are being observed in controlled experiments. So I see this really as an exhibit. It's an exhibit in a critique of axiomatic rational choice theory, which challenges its claim both to predict behaviour and its claim to characterise rationality. And at first I think less so Graham, but I saw it mainly as an exhibit. But over time we became more and more interested in trying to explain actual decision under uncertainty. Particularly, there was an interesting event when Sarah Lichtenstein, the inventor of, the person who did the first experiments on preference reversal, she was actually quite, I would say irritated, I think is a fair word, by our claim to explain the preference reversal phenomenon through regret and through non-transitive preferences, rather than through the difference between choice and valuation. And she sort of invited herself, or she asked to be invited, she came over to visit us in Newcastle and took her out to dinner and all the rest of it. And she said, well, of course it's obvious that, not only is obvious that regret theory can't be the true explanation of preference reversal, but she's effectively accused us of being sort of armchair psychology, not genuine. We weren't genuine. We were only kind of sitting around opportunistically drawing on bits of psychology, but if we ran experiments, we would know the truth as she already did. So we thought, okay, that's it. We're going to run our experiments. So that was when we started running experiments, and we ran them from 1984. And from about 1986, there was a systematic research program at UEA with me and Chris Starmer and Graham on helping out from, it wasn't UEA. And we were basically testing regret theory. So that's really the history of regret theory. So I just wanted to end by saying, well, looking back from the present, what do I think we achieved? Well, it seems to me that we were among the pioneers of a new methodology for studying individual choice. And in contrast to what was the pure theory of the time, the axiomatic rational choice theory, then being sort of fitted to the data, first of all, we were taking the experimental evidence seriously. So this is the sense of Graham listening to the radio and wanting to track down the experiment. So we think the experimental evidence matters, and we want to configure theory to be consistent with this. We're introducing psychological concepts into the theory of choice, which was very unusual at the time. We were challenging the normative status of the most sacred rationality axioms, which was also very new at the time. We were formulating theories with novel predictions that were very bold. I mean, having explained as we thought, having presented the theory as an explanation of the common consequence, common ratio effects that were in Kahneman's diversity paper, and said, oh, it also explains preference reversal. It does so by means of non-transitivity. So we run control tests of its predictions of non-transitivity outside the domain of preference aversion. We also run, so actually interesting feature of the theory is it predicts violations of stochastic dominance, so we set up controlled experiments of that. So we're actually testing the theories. And finally, the thing that, to be honest, I feel, looking back, I feel very proud about is the fact that we did publish results, whatever they were. And indeed, there was quite a long period when our results were very, very good for our theory. And then there was a period when we started finding things that weren't so good. And we did publish more. So it seems to me that quite apart from, I mean, obviously I like regret theory, I think it's a good theory, but quite apart from regret theory itself, I would like to think that we were the pioneers of what is basically a method, I mean, so we're the only pioneers, but we were in a small group of pioneers of behavioural economics. And if you look back and ask, well, what did it feel like to be part of a tiny group of people who were developing this, then I have to say, quoting William Wordsworth, this was in that day a dawn to be alive and to be young, which is a long time ago, was very happy. Thank you very much.
This one works, yeah. Shall I put this one close? No.
Does this work?
Yeah.
Then we'll just put it on here.
Here? Peter, do you mind wearing this?
That's right.
Just put it in here. Can I put this in here? Yep. Oh, I see that you have. It didn't open that.
Maybe in my other pocket here.
It's okay this way.
Yeah. Okay, so now I can have my say on regret theory, which is a big pleasure honor. I will describe the history when regret theory was invented, when this teeny small little group that Bob called it started the behavioral approach. Well, until the end of the 1970s, there wasn't much of it. It was only Homo economicus, only rational models. And Arrow was one of the proponents of that view. A nice citation here, and I'll let you read it. So what he's saying there, not only for normative purposes, but also for empirical purposes, people were assuming rational agents because they thought, well, we know that people are violating rationality axioms, but it happens in a completely chaotic manner. You cannot get any control of that. So we'll take rational agent as the best approximation of what happens empirically. That was the spirit of those days. So they were not interested in theories that have irrationalities involved. But end of the 70s, things started changing, started happening. This started with a teeny group, the behavioral group, as Bob called it. One event was, there was a LA paradox. That was probably the first thing that sparked these ideas, written in '53. But Maurice Allais was a French person, so he thought the whole world should learn French. So he wrote, only in '79 it was published, translated into English, and many people could understand it, also people in this country where we are now. That was one big event that changed a lot. Another big event, so the Allais paradox is one of the two kind of paradoxes that introduced the behavioral approach. The other more fundamental, the one that regret theory takes up as the only theory, is preference reversals. Also in '71 already, Slovich and Liechtenstein, and Bob referred to them, also Lindemann, psychologists invented it, but economists didn't take it very seriously, how the way they do experiments. But '79, some very serious economists did a very serious experiment. They found it again, they confirmed it. And then economists started taking it seriously. A third event was also in the economic journal. All these funny psychological formulas and theories, not very good maybe. Now for the first time, in 1979, a theory with all these psychological funny things occurred in an economic journal. And that was a big breakthrough. I think Kahneman Tversky, 79, you can say that was the birth of the behavioral approach. So then there was a very small, teeny little group that was very much deviating from the quote of Arrow that I showed you before. Because now, the big novelty, the biggest novelty I think of what happened then, what I call rational theories of irrational behavior, and Bob and Graham, please, in a moment I'll come back to you. So here, for the first time, people started incorporating deviation from Homo economicus. They didn't say it's totally chaotic, we can do nothing with it. But they said, we know how to handle it and still have a tractable model and predictions. We think we can get control over these things. Kahneman, Tversky, psychologists were the first to do it. Okay. And Sugden, he described it. Because regret theory was also in this way. They started a bit later. They were inspired by Kahneman and Tversky, but they were maybe the second theory in that spirit, where really you take up all these psychological effects that I may call irrational, where you make a rational model of irrational behavior, although Graham and Bob, they would not call it irrational. So here we can discuss. I personally am too much a Bayesian to have these theories for rational decision making, but empirically it is happening. And surely we are all interested in empirical, what people are really doing. So there Graham, Bob, and I agree. Regret theory is very interesting and important. We need it to understand what consumers are doing. So you can say maybe those of you, maybe a bit older age, remember Mr. Spock, that was Homo economicus from Star Trek. Maybe some of you know. Homer Simpson, that's Homo sapiens. So these are the real consumers, not these. So we have to stop, we have to study those people. Regret theory helped a lot to go that way. So now comes the part, all kind of and we're going to skip most of the mathematics, we don't have so much time. So many paradoxes were introduced, we will not read them, but there was the Allais paradox for decision under risk, and more fundamental was the preference reversal. Allais paradox was still a bit within optimization, rationality, the transitivity at least, but a little bit we should change. But preference reversal, and we will not read it, but preference reversal is more fundamental. The very idea of preference relation, optimization was being challenged here. What does there at all exist of things we know? And maybe the thing to give up here is probably transitivity. That is being challenged by this paradox. It was much more fundamental. I think this historic was the biggest reason why the behavioral approach started. But we will not read it. So all these paradoxes were around, and most theories, this preference is so fundamental, so founded, it's not easy to think, how can you handle it? Almost all the theories, except regret theory, would not touch it. They only touched the Allais paradox. So there were many theories of that kind, and we will not read them, but the most popular competing theories, competing is in my title, so let me mention. Competing theories, the most popular one, prospect theory 79, Chu 83, weighted utility, pretty formula. I think history didn't do justice to this theory, deserves more. Disappointment aversion theory, rank dependent of Quiggin, prospect theory, all kind of theories are being developed. This is probably the most popular theory today for decision under risk, most being used today. All these theories were being developed, but they were all only the Allais paradox, were no big step away from the classical models. But regret theory was more fundamental, so let me show you the formula of that at least. So, then we're going to go. So, here's a probability distribution, P1 probability getting X1 pounds, right? Pn probability get Xn pounds. It is preferred to another lottery of the same kind, but now the amounts are different. You see, I'm using the same probability, but you can always get it done. A little technical thing that I will not explain very much, that these probabilities are correlated, never mind the details now. But anyway, the formula says, this happens if and only if, and first I write the formula of expected utility. Under expected utility, maybe some of you know it, you prefer this to that, if and only if the expected utility difference of the two is non-negative. That's necessary and insufficient. This is the classical theory, nothing happening. Now I add one symbol, give you the most popular version of regret theory. What Loomes and Sugden did is, let us insert here a transformation nonlinear of that utility difference. Not only how much you lose in welfare plays a role, but you have extra feelings. You feel regret if you lose money. It's not only the money you lose, but you feel regret about it. All those emotions come with it. We want to capture them in our theory. And that's what this little extra Q does. Well, it's one symbol, but it changes a lot of things. Because we will not study it, but you can see that if you do it like this, then you can no more separate out the value of the X lottery and the Y lottery. They have no more meaning in isolation. They mean the value of the X lottery depends on the competing lottery. It's a complete breakaway from classical revealed preference approach. So this is much more different from anything we've seen before than all the other formulas. This gives the violation of transitivity. You can't even, it's not easy to speak about optimization even if you use such formulas. This is a very big change of thinking, much more than the other theory. That's what they did. Well, they were, Bob already said, but I can more easily than Bob or Graham make comparison. In the mathematics, such formulas had been used in mathematical literature. Here are two citations. Fishburne was even a decision theorist, but he was interested in the preference axiomatization, not so much in what it means for economics and foundations. There was also David Bell, a decision analyst. He liked to have regret as an attribute of utility. He wrote about that, but that was it. But I think it was Loomes and Sugden who really understood the novelty, who understood that this is a whole new change in all of economic thinking. And in retrospect, now we've seen their careers, we know Loomes, the sharp brains of Loomes, and Bob Sugden, I would say creative and broad. You can imagine if such brains come together, young and enthusiastic, some electricity will take place. That's what happened. They made something everlasting, and that's why we come here together 33 years after to testify that, a happy occasion. They really wrote in such a way that everybody understood something really has to change the economics. We need new behavioral approach. Well, and I think the time is not really yet ready for this. How should we handle this preference reversal? That people doing very different things in optimization. There's not much of it. The regret theory and its close relative is almost the only theory that does anything of that. That would succeed, and I would say it is a nice formula. You can work with it. It's quantitative, and it's capturing something very far away from everything we've seen elsewhere. It's so far the only theory that has done any step in that direction. So a lot of that is yet to come. So in that sense, how is it with it? You can't compare the regret theory with the other theory. This is a much more fundamental change of thinking. We have to do, I think, much more work, much more to see how we can handle such phenomena. That is still a more mature way of behavioral economics to come. And that was inspired by what these authors already wrote 33 years ago. Okay, so that's what I want to say about regret theory.
Equipment, cheers.
Yeah.
Thanks, sorry. I think the guys will... Put this in the pocket, should I?
Nee, mijn pocket zak closed. Hello, my name is Marcel Zeelenberg. It's a big honor to be here in honor of Loomes and Sugden. My whole career is basically based upon reading their work when I was a PhD student. I'm a psychologist. I study how people make decisions, and I study the role of emotions in how when people make decisions. And in '92, I started my PhD, and I read regret theory, and I thought it was time for me to examine some of the psychological foundations of regret theory. And if I mean, I cannot do the sophisticated stuff that Peter just did, so this is my summary of regret theory. People compare the outcomes of their choice with what the outcome would have been had they chosen differently, and they can feel regret or rejoicing as a result of that. When they make decisions, they anticipate that beforehand, they take that into account, and they choose in order to avoid regret or to maximize rejoicing. And so that is what I took from regret theory. And what I realized then is that resolution of the chosen and the unchosen option is very important. You can only feel regret if you can compare your outcome with what you would have received had you chosen differently. If you cannot make that comparison, you feel no regret. So the comparison element is important, and the resolution is important. I started to study regret as an emotion, and I dived into the emotion literature, and you find many studies of emotion, but nobody studied regret as an emotion. In emotion theories, regret did not play a role. Mainly, I think, because many of the emotions that were studied were emotions that have very clear facial expressions. And the idea was that regret is a very cognitive emotion. It doesn't have clear facial expressions. We know better nowadays. These are all men that regret something. It's a specific type of regret. And this is how they look when they apologize in public. Regret is an emotional state, and it stems from comparing what is to what might have been. Together with, so this is Erik van Dijk, one of my colleagues. I have pictures of my colleagues here so that you don't think that all men in the Netherlands don't have hair. The three guys you see today don't have hair, but there are guys with hair in the Netherlands. This is Erik van Dijk, one of my colleagues. We studied the role of comparison processes in regret. So we had participants read a scenario. You want to buy an instant lottery ticket, you're just in time, there are only 2 lottery tickets left. You choose a ticket and open it, and what happens? You have won a liquor store token for 15 euros, like a voucher you can use to buy liquor. You see somebody else buying the lottery ticket that was left, the one you didn't choose. This person wins a book token of 50 euros, a voucher you can take to a bookshop and buy books for 50 euros. And what we manipulated is how easily you can compare this. So you either win a liquor store token or a book token, and you either miss out on a liquor store token or a book token. And the idea was, if you win a liquor store token of 15 and you miss out on a liquor store token, it's much more easy to compare, and you feel more regret. And that is precisely what we found. So if you miss out on a book token and you have a book token yourself, that's more painful than if you miss out on a liquor store token. If you have a liquor store token and you miss out on the book token. So comparison processes are important in regret. Here's something else we did. This paper just came out last December. If you want to study emotions if you want to use emotions in theories about choice, it is nice to know if people in different countries actually refer to the same things if they talk about emotions. So we did a study with data from the Netherlands, from the US, from Taiwan, and from Israel, and we compared what people talk about when they talk about regret, when they talk about disappointment, and when they talk about guilt. And we found that these, I'm not going to tell you all the details, but what we found is there's a very nice solution in the data that is similar in all the countries. So when we talk about spijt in Dutch, it's the same as English people when they talk about regret. And I do not know the Chinese and the Israeli word for it. But at least those concepts translate well into other countries. My first work on regret I did with Jane Beattie at the University of Sussex. And this is when I had just started reading about regret theory and realized that resolution of the chosen and the unchosen options was very important. So what did we do? We wanted to study whether actually people anticipate regrets and whether their decisions are influenced by it. And in many articles I read that people thought that if you anticipate regret, you will become risk averse. And when I looked at the decision problems, I thought that cannot be the case. So what we did is we confronted people with 2 gambles, one relatively risky, the other relatively safe. And we told people in one treatment, we told them, listen, you're going to make a decision between those 2 gambles. We will always tell you the outcome of the risky gamble, this one. So if you choose this gamble, you only know this outcome. If you choose the other gamble, you'll know both outcomes. And the idea was then, if people are regret averse, they will choose the risky gamble because then they do not know, they do not learn what they miss out on. In the safe feedback condition, we told people, listen, you will always learn the outcome of the safe gamble. If you choose the safe gamble, you only know that. If you choose the risky gamble, you learn both outcomes. And then again, they can compare outcomes and they can feel regret. And what we found is that if they know that they will learn outcome about the risky option, they're more likely to choose the risky option. If they know they will get the outcome of the safe option, they are more likely to choose the safer option. Which is consistent with the ideas that they are preventing themselves from comparing outcomes post hoc. We did a variation of that with an ultimatum game. So we had people in a hypothetical ultimatum game divide 100 Dutch guilders between themselves and a responder. And in one condition we just played the game. In the other condition we told them, you will not only learn whether your offer is accepted or rejected, you will also learn what the minimal acceptable offer was of the other person. And most people in the ultimatum game give a 50-50 split. But if they then think, ooh, I also learned what the minimal acceptable offer was, they may start some mental simulations and then realize, I would probably accept 20. And then realizing that they give 50, but they could have given 20, they feel regret over the 20 is the idea, and their offers become lower. And that's what we found. If people know they will get feedback, they give lower offers in the ultimatum game. On one of my trips to Brighton, where I worked with Jane Beatty, I read this clip in the newspaper. There was a man in April '95 in Liverpool who committed suicide after finding out that the lottery combination was 14, 70, 22, 24, 42, 47. This guy always played with these numbers, but he realized then that he had forgotten to renew his ticket. And as a result, he killed himself. That's a dramatic impact of regret. I'm not saying that regret is always that important, but it reminded me of how bad lotteries can be. And we have a lottery like that in the Netherlands. We have a lottery that is called the Postcode Lottery, where your ticket number is your postcode or your zip code. So this is actually a letter that I received. M. Zeelenberg, that's me. I live in the Burgemeester van Meurstraat 23. And this is important. This is my postcode, 5037ND in Tilburg. There's a number of houses in my street that have the same postcode, and that is then an important part of your ticket number. So the postcode lottery, what they do is, they draw a postcode, and if there's somebody who has a ticket, they win. But the neighbors who have the same postcode and who don't have a ticket, they don't win. They know that had they bought a ticket, they would have also been millionaire. So this is like, it's not a very nice lottery, I think. So this is the letter I got at home. It says, in 5037ND, there are 6 potential winners. 10.2 million will be paid out, is guaranteed to be paid out in a few weeks. Make sure you're there as well. So I thought, what's going on? So I phoned them. I said, do I live in the winning postcode? No. There are 6 people in your postcode area that actually play. If they win, they get money. And you're not one of them, so you don't get money. So I was annoyed. I throw it away. And this is the flip side of the envelope. It says, when the summer whopper of 10.2 million falls on your postcode, will you be standing there empty-handed, congratulating your winning neighbors? That cannot be the case. This is your last opportunity to act on that. So I realized that the postcode lottery is actually a regret lottery. What Rick Peters, also here you see, and I did, is we did a big survey using a big panel that Tilburg University has, where we compared people's attitudes towards playing the state lottery. The state lottery in the Netherlands, you just buy a ticket that has a number printed on it, and the postcode lottery. And we found that in both cases, the attitude towards playing in the lottery predicted whether people want to continue playing in the lottery, but only in case of the, you don't see it here, this is of the postcode lottery, only in the case of the postcode lottery, thoughts about anticipated regret actually significantly predicted continuing to play in that lottery. So this is a sort of regret blackmail. So what the postcode lottery do is they sort of they have a regret appeal, and they make you play, not only because you like it, but also because you are afraid that your neighbors will win money and you won't. Well, these are some of the studies that we have been doing. We've got loads of other studies. We have a paper in press about the effects of regret in trust games. We have studied how people are reluctant to exchange lottery tickets, and you can sort of cancel that out by taking away the regret. I do not have the time to talk about these studies, but I'm willing to send you the papers. What's next? So what are we doing next? Well, I'm not going in the direction of axiomas and complex experiments, but I am trying to study what can people do in order to avoid regret? Well, they can make regret-averse choices, as we have found, but what they also can do is try to make better choices, think better in order to avoid regret. They can buy insurance in order to prevent regret. They can lower their standards, think, well, this will never work, and try to manage the regret like that. I'm also interested in, if people then feel regret, what do they do afterwards? How does that influence their behavior? And one of the final questions that I'm interested in is, are there stable differences in regret aversion? Do some people take regret into account more than others? And how does that influence choice? I think there is lots of research before us, ahead of us. And I don't know where it's going, but I know where it started. It started with those two guys in 1982. Thank you.
All right. If you look at the program, you'll see that somehow, after I sent my slides to the organizers, they decided to change the title from the empirical success of regret theory into empirical evidence on regret theory. I can assure you I had nothing to do with that. I'll really try to focus on the success of regret theory throughout my presentation. If you look at the empirical evidence on regret theory, you can broadly distinguish 3 periods, which also broadly span 3 decades. And the first period is really, and Bob already referred to that, is a period of success. There were many studies, mainly done by Graham and Bob, often together with Chris Tarmer, which showed that many of the predictions of regret theory were borne out in the data. To give you just an example, this is a study that Graham did in 1988, a paper published in the American Economic Review. And Graham gave his subjects 2 tasks. He said, this is the first task, you have 2 actions. You have a bowl of lottery tickets with numbers between 1 and 100. There's 2 actions, A and B. If a number between 1 and 40 comes up, under A you get amount A0, under B you get nothing. If a number between 41 and 100 comes up, you get 0 under A and 12 pounds under B. And Graham asked him, well, what amount A0 will make you indifferent between actions A and B? And then the next task, it was A prime and B prime, looked a lot like it, except that some of that 12 pounds was shifted. So now if you get 1 between 1 and 40, you get A1 under A prime and 12 under B. 41 and 60, well, you can see nothing under A prime, 12 under B prime, 61, 100, you get nothing anyhow. And of course, any theory which says, well, your preferences of a lottery should be only determined by the probability distribution they induce, say, well, people should make the same choice here. A0 should be equal to A1. But not so for regret theory, because there is a subtle difference. If we look at A and B, you see that if a number between 1 and 40 comes up, if you choose A, you could say, well, there's rejoice, because you get A0 instead of nothing. On the other hand, if you choose A and a number between 0 and 41 and 100 comes up, there's regret because you get nothing and you could have had 12. So if you look at that function Q that Peter showed to you, what regret theory usually assumes it's convex. It means there's an overweighting of extreme outcome differences. And that overweighting means that A0 doesn't have to be much larger than 12 to make sure that these 2 lotteries, these 2 actions, as regret theory calls them, are equivalent. But in the second choice, the situation is different, because now your rejoice is only A1 minus 12, and the regret is still 12. So now what happens, if we take that difference between A0 and 12 and we move it back to the scale, you see there's not very much rejoice at all, whereas the regret stays the same. So the rejoice is way too low to produce an indifference, and it should really be increased from A0 to A1. So that's the prediction of regret theory. And Graham tested that, and indeed he found in this choice A0 was equal to 17 pounds 52 on average. In this one it was 2258. Clear support for regret theory. And as I said, there was a whole range of studies which all basically confirmed the predictions of regret theory, and perhaps sort of the culmination of that research was a paper that Bob Graham and Chris Talmer published in Econometrica in '91, where they showed that regret could indeed explain preference reversals. I was about to explain what preference reversals are, but Horst already mentioned it, Bob mentioned it, Peter mentioned it, so I don't think there's a point in explaining it again. Only thing is that if you have, for example, this was one of the patterns they gave to their subjects, and indeed what you can see is that regret theory can very easily explain that people prefer, in a choice between the p-bet and the pound bet, people choose the p-bet. In a choice between the certainty equivalent and the p-bet, people go for the certainty equivalent. And in a choice between the pound bet and the certainty equivalent, people go for the pound bet. If you, for example, take a utility function, Peter showed you the formula, you take a power function with a power coefficient of 0.8, you take for the regret function also a power function with a power of 1.5, and those are really reasonable values, because in a paper a couple of years ago, together with Enrico Getzegiu and Alessandra Cilo, we measured regret theory's parameters, and those were more or less described the preferences of our average subject, and then indeed you get the cycles that regret theory predicts, these preference reversal cycles, and also in that very nice paper, around 30% of the subjects indeed showed those cycles. So that, as I said, you could maybe say that sort of ended the success period of regret. Then we moved on to a period of some challenge, we might say. There were already some people who pointed out some evidence that was a bit problematic for regret theory. There was a paper by David Harless who said, well, indeed, if you present your gambles in this way, in this matrix format, we find clear effect of regret effects. However, if I use different formats, different ways of displaying these gambles, there was much less support for these predictions of regret theory. There was some work from psychologists, mainly starting already from Tversky 69, who produced cycles which really were opposite to the cycles that regret theory predicted. They were in the literature referred to as similarity cycles. There was some work by mathematical psychologists. There was a paper by Iverson and Falmagno already in Mathematical Social Sciences in '85. And they showed that, well, these observed cycles may not be inconsistent with transitivity of preferences if we take into account the stochastic nature of human judgment. And that's, of course, a topic on which Bob and Graham later have also worked a lot. But the main blow to regret theory actually was landed by two of its main proponents, Bob and Chris Talmer, in a paper in the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty, '93. And what they found there was that these regret effects really could also be explained by a phenomenon known as event splitting, which means that if we split an event in two separate events, its attractiveness increases. Just to go back to these gambles, these actions that Graham presented, here we have these two, and we said, okay, regret theory says in the first one A should be chosen, second one B prime should be chosen. But that could be due to regret, as we just saw, but it could also be due to something else, that if we compare these actions, you see that in B prime, the 12 pound has been split into two. And then event splitting says, well, B prime becomes more attractive, and that can explain why people first go for A, then for B prime. So what Bob and Chris did is that they also presented that first action in this way. And under regret theory, it's exactly the same, because the juxtaposition of the outcome still remains the same. And then compared it also with that second problem, so that's exactly the same in this one. So regret says if people are more likely to choose A and B prime in the first two, they should also be more likely to choose A and B prime in the last two. But event splitting says no, that doesn't have to happen, because in problem 3 and 4, the 12 is always split into two. And that prediction of this event splitting was exactly what Bob and Chris observed. And that paper really, I started doing research when that paper came out, and it has always been a source of inspiration for me, because and Bob also mentioned that we published the results regardless whether they were favorable, yes or no, and I thought that was really a very nice example of an open mind towards research. And I can only share Colin Cameron's praise, who in '95 in his handbook wrote, "This is a story of truly successful detective work." Did that end regret theory? Definitely not. In his very nice paper in the Journal of Economic Literature on non-expected utility by Chris Starmer, he already said, well, regret theory gave insights in many real-world phenomena, and indeed, and now I come to the third period of the empirical evidence on regret theory, there have been many, many applications of regret. Marcel already pointed them out in psychology. Here are just some applications. The list by no means is complete. In economics of ideas of regret theory, Barberis, you probably cannot read it, it's a bit too small. The first one is a paper by Barberis, Huang, and Taylor, published in the American Economic Review, where they show that regret theory can explain the stock market participation puzzle. This Feliz Osbai and Osbai is another paper from the American Economic Review, which shows it can explain the significant overbidding in first price auctions. And also in our theoretical work, in our I mean Peter, and also Horst, we used a lot this idea of regret theory, that you compare alternatives on attributes and use that to design preference conditions. And in the 2000s also saw all kinds of new insights. There was, of course, the emergence of neuroeconomics. And these studies from neuroeconomics indeed showed that regret somehow plays a role in the brain. The study by Camille et al. Is a very nice study which shows that people with some kind of brain damage who do not feel regret make worse decisions than people who do experience regret. And then maybe that touches again on this discussion, is regret rational, yes or no? And there were also all kind of new models which explicitly acknowledged the influence of Loomes and Sugden's paper. There's the work by Savre and Hayashi, who focus on menu-dependent choice. So they look on sets of actions, and then they model regret by including a monotonicity condition. Well, expanding the set is not always a good thing because it may lead to feelings of regret. Graham himself came up with a new model, the PRAM, Perceived Relative Advantage model, if I'm right, Graham. I always make a mistake there somehow. But and what he does there, in regret, people transform these outcome differences. In Graham's model, they also transform probability difference, and that model can explain not only regret cycles, but also similarity cycles and many other empirical regularities. And finally, there's the Salience Theory by Badala, Giannaioli, and Schleifer, who also look at outcome differences. The only difference is they do not transform the outcome difference themselves, but they look at states with large outcome difference and then transform the probabilities of the states. But it's clearly inspired by regret theory. Like regret, they also stick to the sure thing principle. It can allow intransitivities of choice, although they do not acknowledge it as explicitly as Loomes and Sugden did in their 1982 paper. So to sum up, even though perhaps the evidence wasn't as favorable as those that early decades suggested, Loomes and Sugden's very careful thinking about feelings of regret and also the elementary violations of things like transitivity that it can inspire has led to many new ideas and insights, and I hope my short presentation has given you some idea about those. Thank you.
Do I just close this down? Okay, thanks very much. Well, as Bob said, we do feel greatly honoured by having this paper included in the 125th anniversary issue, and we feel lucky that we're still alive 33 years later to talk about it. So where next? Or how does one move on beyond regret theory rather than just trying to live on the royalties? So what I'd like to talk about a little bit about are the comparisons between models as they now are and the behaviour, which as Bob indicated, originally I think I was more interested in explaining the behaviour that Kahneman and Tversky had put together in the prospect theory paper, because after my colleague had told me about this paper and I'd got hold of a copy of it, I went through all of the questions that they asked their subjects, and I found that I was doing pretty much everything that the majority of their subjects did, in violation of all of these principles. But I reflected that since I was perfectly rational, it must be perfectly rational to behave in that way. Since then, there have been many models have come onto the market. And in fact, I think there's probably dozens. Peter would know because he keeps a much better track of these things. You might even be able to find 100 different decision models about risky choice. And for the most part, these models are deterministic. But the patterns of behaviour, we know when we repeat the same question several times in an experiment, separated by other distractor tasks, behaviour tends to be probabilistic. Most people will answer exactly the same question, presented in exactly the same way, sometimes one way, sometimes the other, over some range of parameters. 90–95% of a subject pool will do that for some problems under some circumstances. So the reality, and it was known way back by Mostella and Noji in 1951, the reality is that people's choice behaviour and other kinds of decision behaviour is probabilistic rather than deterministic. Models, particularly in the days when there was a great deal to be said for having models that were analytically tractable, a great weight was placed on parsimony, on only doing the bare minimum that you could do in order to get a result. But the reality, I think, is that decision-making is multifaceted. A lot of the observations of the way in which the brain functions when decisions are being made suggest that there's parallel processing going on, that people are attending to a number of different things that they're bringing together. Some of, Bob's talked about this as exhibits. Sometimes when several of these tendencies come together at the same time, they produce these really strong effects, which are the exhibits that tend to get into the literature. The things that you can almost always reproduce when you're doing a lecture, like the common ratio effect or the preference reversal phenomenon. But sometimes these different influences work in different directions and cancel one another out, so that these effects are less clearly and sharply observed in other kinds of parameterizations. And many of these models, as Peter pointed out, and Han too, are procedurally invariant, that they don't really pay very much attention to the way the problem is presented. Whereas the reality is that most people's responses are liable to be sensitive to the context, to the nature of the task, to the procedure, to the way in which the task is framed. When Sarah Lichtenstein was irritated with us all those years ago for not recognizing that what was really going on with the preference reversal phenomenon was the difference in the way people process choice as opposed to valuation, actually she had a point, because they do, people do process these things rather differently. But standard models of the kind that most of us have been involved with tend not to have a place for that kind of action. So the way in which what I'd like to talk about is the sort of thing that you see in laboratory choice, is to consider a so-called simple choice. There are just two lotteries, each with two outcomes, two fairly simple probabilities, and those payoffs. And what a typical participant taking part in this experiment will see, they'll look at something like that, and they'll make, eye tracking indicates that they'll make a number of comparisons. They'll attend to a variety of things. So they might look at payoff comparisons between the alternatives. So they might do a kind of regret type thing of looking at the payoff comparisons that way. But they might also be interested in identifying the best and the worst. They might be interested in the spreads, the degree of dispersion or variance within an alternative. Their judgments might be about differences, but they might also be about ratios. £60 is twice £30, as well as the difference between £60 and £30. They might consider whether a chance of an outcome is a decent chance or not such a great chance, rather than giving particular attention to the exact numbers that are involved in it. And they'll be concerned with the probability and payoff interactions. And other things might be suggested by different choices. If you were to put this choice, this slightly different choice up, all of those things will hold. But also in this case, because things are a little bit different, it may be that they'll look at certain things which are similar, like those payoffs and these probabilities, and give much less weight to them and focus their attention instead on the thing that is really more obviously different between the two, particularly if doing the computations of expected value and so on are a little bit more demanding. I mean, they're in a laboratory experiment, they've come to make some money, hopefully. They're not going to be wanting to spend too much time. They're not necessarily, some people bring their calculators, most people don't. And they'll be looking for ways of solving the problem that you put in front of them. And so in the way that I've described, the way that people might attend to different things, you've got comparisons across the alternatives, the regret type of consideration, the disappointment or elation type of consideration, looking at spreads, or the similarity consideration, the possibility that probabilities will be transformed in some way into, perhaps non-linearly, into weights. And they're just some of those things, and even those things could be modelled in a variety of different ways. So my thinking is that the general model is one where you could imagine somebody in a laboratory processing a number of pairwise comparisons, sometimes between, sometimes within, and it's as if they're sampling these things momentarily and they're using the information, their responses, their internal responses, as a form of evidence that might be counted in favour of one option or in favour of the other. And the process of sitting there and looking at the screen in front of them and trying to figure out what they are going to choose to do might be thought of as accumulating this sampled evidence until you reach a point after a certain amount of deliberation where the imbalance of the evidence sufficiently in favour of one or the other alternative triggers a choice. You become sufficiently confident that one thing is better than the other, you're going to go for it. Or alternatively, you reach the conclusion that there's not much to choose between the two, and you mentally spin a coin, or you go on the basis of some tie-breaking insight. And that, I think, would represent the process by which many people are operating with the stimuli in front of them in a laboratory experiment. Now, if that's true, if that's an account of what many of the people we recruit to our experiments are doing, and perhaps people are doing when they're making more important than laboratory experiment decisions in real life, then there may be a number of implications. One is, it gives you probabilistic choice. Because if it's a sampling procedure, exactly the same scenario in terms of what's on the screen may be processed differently on different occasions that somebody comes across it in an experiment. So sometimes the sampling triggers you in one direction, sometimes in another direction. The other thing which most deterministic or standard theories don't take any account of or make any explanation of is the fact that you take different amounts of time, and the amount of time that respondents take is clearly related to the probability that they'll be going one way or the other. In those cases where they're likely to go for A on some occasions and B for others, they will often take longer. The cases where they always go for A or always go for B are relatively easy, they don't take so long about it. Variability in that sense isn't necessarily an error. It's the fact that you're only going to sample up to a certain point, then you're going to stop because you've got other questions in the experiment and the rest of your life to lead. So you can't sit there deliberating about one lottery experiment in a laboratory forever. And it also means, though, that if a lot of these things, these between alternatives and within alternatives and combinations of one kind or another, if all of these things are actually going on during the sampling process, but the models are highly restrictive and parsimonious and effectively ruling out a number of those things, then that will distort your ability to recover the parameters and to do the kinds of tests that you might be trying to do. Different procedures, ways of framing may influence the sampling procedure in ways that lead to systematically different patterns. That's one way of presenting the choice. That's another way of presenting exactly the same choice. What Han talked about was the fact that when those different alternatives were set up with different juxtapositions, some of the regret effects looked like they were to do with event splitting, because that was encouraging people to process the problems differently. Not to mention other types of tasks like probability equivalence, certainty equivalence, buying and selling, multiple price lists, ranking, all the other ways in which we might try and get at people's preferences. The nature of the different procedures is liable to influence the way that the processing of the alternatives goes on, and therefore perhaps the patterns of responses that we get. So, deterministic core theories plus some add-on white noise that's plucked off the shelf, a normal distribution, a log normal distribution, some kind of loose choice rule, those sorts of things won't really do if the reality is the way that I tried to describe it earlier. What is needed is multiple influence, probabilistic, process-based models where context effects or framing effects are actually part of the story, not just an inconvenient nuisance that economists think, oh, I wish this would go away. It's something to do. It's integral to the process by which people are arriving at their decisions. So this is not simply this kind of development of models in this direction. I mean, I'm calling my talk Beyond Regret, but actually it's really before regret. Because Herbert Simon's Nobel Prize-winning talk was in 1978, before prospect theory, before regret theory, before all of these models, was appealing to economists to learn something from some other disciplines, like psychology, for example, and maybe these days neuroscience, and to develop models not of substantive rationality alone, but of procedural rationality, to understand the procedures by which people arrive at their decisions, and to see, if one takes that approach, whether we can get a better descriptive explanation, we can take up the issues of the normative status of these things. So, to finish off with, most of the talk was about regret. Actually, Han, I think, was the only one who mentioned the upside, which is rejoicing. So there is an upside, although regret appeals to an economic audience because it is, after all, the dismal profession. But I want to say that I rejoice that Bob and I got together and had the opportunity to work on this stuff over the years. I regret slightly that I didn't have more courage in my convictions earlier on that these process models were the way to go. But I guess that one of the functions of regret is to teach us something, to help us to learn, to help us perhaps to change our behaviour in the future. So I'm hoping that if we're lucky enough all to come together for the 150th anniversary of the Economic Journal, then we'll have moved on a little bit in the direction of developing these process models, while still reflecting that, you know, regret was some contribution to the process along the way. Thank you very much.
So we have some time for questions and discussion. Not the easiest way. Maybe the authors, the presenters would come up front and the audience can ask questions. Yes, please.
This question is directed to Bob initially, but I'm happy to know what the other panel members might think. It was tremendous set of talks and talking about sort of everything that regret theory has managed to do over the past 33 years. But I was just interested, Bob, you started off as a social choice and welfare economist, and economists were interested in predictions of choice, but we're also interested for evaluating economic settings. So if you have some ideas of how do we do welfare economics with regret theory?
Well, it's a big question. What I'm actually working, I mean, I said at the beginning that I've never really believed in rationality, and so I think that it seems to me that the bigger question is how to do welfare economics without assuming rationality. And I mean, I've worked on this now for about 10 years. I'm still trying to write a book on it, but my basic theme is, which also comes back to, I mean, when I was as a social choice theorist, my main interest was in trying to formalise liberty, and so I was sort of a liberal social welfare theorist. And I'm trying to say, well, if you shift the evaluation from preference satisfaction to opportunity, and you say what it is to giving people more opportunity, then you don't actually have to worry about what your preferences are. So the thought is trying to find normative criteria that don't require you to think about what your preference and which I can say, well, I know my preference is irrational, but still I like it to be the case that I can choose for myself what to do. So I'm all for sort of trying to go, and in one way it's also actually just a quick one. So if you actually think about how economics developed, prior to the 1870s, there was a normative economics beginning to develop which didn't actually have rationality at all. So I think the answer is to try to go back to pre-1870 and go for a normative economics without rationality.
Thank you. Further questions?
Hiya. I was just wondering, so everything you framed so far was thinking about here's what you could have won. I was wondering if you did anything to do with here's what you could have lost. For example, so if in the situations you had, you could have won, I don't know, £30, or you could have won nothing. But what about if you could have lost £30 and you could have won nothing?
I'm not sure. Is this working? Is that okay? All right, just hold it here then. Yes. Well, we didn't do nearly as much of that kind of thing experimentally. One of the issues, I guess, is that actually getting people to do things with losses, with real losses, given that people wanted these things to be incentivized, was a bit more tricky because if you gave them something to start with as house money, then maybe they would behave a little bit differently and integrate the two things. But I did do a paper with somebody who was actually an undergraduate student at the time doing a project at the University of York called Karen Taylor, where we set up the system but with losses rather than gains. It was hypothetical, but the predictions of the model turned out to work remarkably well, despite the fact people weren't actually parting with any money.
Hello. So let me ask two questions. So I first think the regret theory is a wonderful theory, and I truly appreciate the contribution you made. And I think the regret theory now has two difficulties. One difficulty here is the application to the strategic environment. The second difficulty here is application to the dynamic environment. The strategic environment, so it's sometimes very tough to find a fixed point of the solution of the game. And the second difficulty, dynamic regrets. So the question will be, when do we regret? And how do you see these difficulties? And how do you expect what's going to happen in the future of the economic research?
I would have thought that, I don't know much about dynamic. I would have thought, strategic, I would have thought was, at least if you're dealing in equilibrium, it would be fairly straightforward, because if you're doing equilibrium theory, you have expected utility, and you'd say you assume in equilibrium you know what your opponent is going to do or what probabilities they're doing. So I would have thought the idea of applying regret theory to games would be quite possible. Although just as an aside, I mean, quite an early stage when we were working on it, we used to go to these what are called the FUR conferences, which are the big non-expected utility theory conferences. People would often say to us, "Oh, why don't you go away and think of stop trying to why are you constantly running these experiments just to try to test it? Why don't you think of its applications to all these other domains?" And I always said, "Well, I'm hoping it's going to work. I would sort of prioritize if we want to limit my time. I prioritize testing the theory in the simplest environments and seeing if it works." And then if it works, other people will take it up and they'll start extending it. So, and then when it didn't work so well, I began to sort of not. But I always felt that the most important thing was to test it in its simplest situations. But I do think it should apply to
yes, and I think that one of the things that Marcel talked a little bit about, and we were chatting about before we came up here, was a sort of a connection between regret and also things like envy. And it's not quite clear it's on the borderline, isn't it? The Dutch lottery, the postcode lottery, because what's a real sickener is when you see these people driving away in their Rolls Royce, pursuing the furniture wagon as they go off to the countryside, and you're left there behind. And again, in strategic environments, one of the things that's become of considerable interest in over the years has been people's sort of social preferences, so-called, their attitude to how their payment stands in relation to the payment for the other player, and they might very well take that into account. And it's perfectly possible to imagine that when you're looking at strategies, you're just playing a game against another person rather than a game against nature. And you can easily imagine, well, if that person played left or right as the column player, and I've got to choose between up and down, it's not just what the payoffs would be, but it's how I would feel about the fact that I've made the wrong decision if that turns out, or how rejoicing I'll be if it turns out I've made the right decision. So I don't think there's any reason at all why that kind of notion shouldn't be incorporated into strategic environments, and I think that in some forms, through attention to social preferences and so on, it has been.
Thank you. Further questions? May I follow up with a question? I would like to ask Bob, who knows a little bit about axiomatics, and then also Peter. I don't want to ask Graham because he doesn't care about axiomatics. In models in economics, often continuity is assumed. I have not seen an axiomatic model with continuous utility for regret. Is that perhaps a potential reason why the theory hasn't been applied so widely in economics? And to Peter, the question, is continuity as such a property that we should value much? What kind of behavioral content has it after all, if any?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand your question. Can you just rephrase it? I mean,
so
obviously there have been axiomatizations of regret theory, and I certainly produced one which was, I mean, on the whole, when you axiomatize it, at least the way I was axiomatizing it, it's actually very, very similar to Savage. If you take Savage's basic axioms, you only need to sort of tinker around a little bit to get regret. So I would have thought that, to be honest, I can't remember how the axiom system worked, because I'm not really that keen on the axiomatic system. But it seemed at the time it's interesting to know how a theory relates together. So I thought it was quite interesting to know sort of how similar and how different it would be from Savage's theory. But I would have thought we'd have to have some kind of continuity axiom.
What I meant is continuous utility, and I think Savage doesn't need it. And I think not having a continuous utility may perhaps for fixed point analysis or other things in economics may play a role.
Well, wouldn't the point be that we don't need? I see what you mean. We don't need an axiom of it. On the other hand, all the actual practical models of it have got continuous functions, and the same would be true of Savage, wouldn't it? In a sense, so I don't think that could be a problem for the theory. It's just saying it just turns out that you don't need the axiom. Isn't it?
I think in some setups you don't need it, but I think for applications it would be nice to have a theory that backs up for applications with a continuous utility. But maybe that's a detail that's not so important now. Peter?
So I hope I can be heard. Well, you asked me about how nice continuity is, and many people think that continuity is only a technical axiom, but in fact it does have empirical implications. It is not only technical, and we don't know what those empirical implications are. That makes it a dangerous and bad axiom. If it were only technical, it wouldn't harm so much. So it is very nice if we can give axiomatization with as little continuity as possible, and that's very difficult. But I guess we're getting away from regret theory now. But that's the view on continuity, and a warning that it's a dangerous axiom.
Well, some people may regret doing axiomatics. But any more questions? Any other question? Any more? So maybe among the presenters you have questions?
I have a question to Marcel about the Dutch lottery that is using regret. I think the people in Holland who are subject to regret get punished by that lottery, but I think it's good they are irrational, and by evolutionary processes they might disappear, become poor, and Holland may become more richer than the other countries. So, and we get rid of all the regret people in Holland. We don't need a regret theory in Holland anymore. So don't you think it's a very good lottery?
I don't think it's stupid to feel regret. I'm sure you might have felt it one day yourself. I feel regret every now and then. Do I like the lottery? Do I think it's a good lottery? I think it's a horrible lottery. And in fact, when we published our paper, there was a journalist coming to do an interview on decision making, and I was very enthusiastically talking about this paper. So she made it into a story only about this paper, and then they were actually asking questions in the parliament about this lottery. And then, like a week later, the lottery fell on a little city close to Tilburg, Sugden, I think is the name, and a woman. It's a pretty rich village. There was one woman who didn't play and didn't win, but she sued the Postcode Lottery. So she sued the lottery for causing psychological damage to her. And her lawyer asked me to be an expert witness. And I said, well, I can't because I don't know that woman and I don't know how she was before and I don't know how to establish psychological damage. She lost the case on all accounts, which I think was a wise decision. But there was one thing she asked for, which I thought was very friendly. The Postcode Lottery, it's a horrible lottery. I think they only pay like 30% of the money that comes in goes to the prize, to the prize money, which is you could better play the state lottery, which I think pays 80% out in prize money. But they have a team of psychologists that help the prize winners to cope with the fact that they are suddenly very rich. They don't have a team of psychologists that help the non-prize winners to cope with the fact that they're living among rich people. So one of the things she asked in that lawsuit is, why doesn't the Postcode Lottery also help the people that actually lose? Because it's the only lottery I know where you can actually lose by not playing. All the other lotteries you can only lose if you play, but the Postcode Lottery you can actually you participate even though you don't want to participate because everybody has a postcode. And we know we have laws in the Netherlands and in many other countries that if you go to a doctor, he cannot test your blood for all sorts of diseases and give you that information. Well, the Postcode Lottery can give you all sorts of information about you might have been a millionaire had you played our had you played our lottery, and I think that's a very nasty thing to do. So instead of keeping the lottery and sending away the people that feel regret, I propose we skip the lottery and keep the people.
Further questions? Then I have a question to Han, maybe also a final question. You have done a lot of measurements on prospect theory, so loss aversion, other utility for gains, utility for losses, probability weighting. You have done measurements for regret theory. Have you done both to see whether what is going on exactly? And what is your feeling on what is actually going on? More regret or more loss aversion or more of whatever?
Well, I think in his presentation, sort of Graham already basically answered that question when he said, yeah, you can give it a different name. It's probably tapping into something which is somewhat similar. I think actually to merge regret theory with prospect theory would be a very fruitful strategy, because one of the problems in prospect theory is that we do not know how the reference point is formed, and I think there we can, prospect theory can learn a lot from regret, that it's these interactions between X or lotteries that really shape people's reference points. So that's maybe something I would like to add to Graham's presentation, where to go next. That is something that's really worthwhile working on.
And could I just add to that? I think that two of the things that Bob and I thought about at various times but couldn't agree about, and some people here know Bob very well, and they know that it's extremely difficult to find anything that you can agree, that he'll agree with you about. You can agree with him lots, but it's not always working the other way around. But one of those was the thing that Marcel and his colleagues have picked up, which was the importance of whether you do or don't know the outcome, the resolution, and we didn't manage to incorporate that into the model. And the other one, I think, was a reference point. We had a sort of a sense that the reference point and people's coding of these things relative to the reference point might indeed be influential, and that you could perhaps, under those circumstances, you could dispense with rejoicing altogether. You could just have the downside regret relative to your reference point. That alone would be able to do work which was quite similar in many ways to the way that loss aversion works, I think. But we didn't have a reference point. We had these things as, you know, both of the alternatives were viewed as if from not having either of them was the kind of starting position in the way that the model was formulated.
Just one thing on that. I mean, I think actually, when you say about one of the peculiar things about regret theory, sort of mathematically or formally, is that because everything depends on, as Peter was showing, and the function of the difference between the two utilities, it's actually, there isn't really in the standards version, there isn't really a distinction between regret and rejoicing, because all you ever know is it's the difference between what the function is a function of the kind of net difference between the regrets and the rejoicing. And so actually, we always thought of it as being predominantly regrets, and it seems psychologically that seems plausible. I don't think there's anything in the theory that actually says there has to be. I think it could just as well be all done by rejoicing.
So rejoicing is quite a nice way to finish then. I would like to thank the presenters, the authors of this paper that gave us also the occasion to come together and discuss a little bit about regret and rejoicing. Thank you very much.